Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you so much for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Dana Miller-Cotto from Kent State University. Thanks for coming in to chat today, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
So as usual, before we jump into the topic of the day, could you tell our listeners a bit about your professional training, what you're teaching at Kent State, and anything you think might be helpful for kind of the context of your institution, please?
Sure. So training-wise, well, currently I'm an assistant professor at Kent State University in psychological sciences. Training, I'm actually trained as an educational psychologist. I got my PhD at Temple University in Philadelphia. My background, I'd say when I was an undergrad and I was working in an adult cognition lab, I did a lot of work on false memory using the Dees-Roediger-McDermott paradigm. I got really interested in memory, but then I got really interested in thinking about educational implications, using like a bridge between psychology and education to figure out real-world problems, in particular educational disparities. And so I think I started out thinking of like, what are these huge cognitive predictors, these popular constructs in psychology, and how do they predict academic outcomes as it relates to math? I think the more work I did, the more I realized that early outcomes or early antecedent factors are really important. Started really focusing on these early math concepts and how it relates to executive functions, which was often a strong predictor of math outcomes or reading outcomes as well, in particular in mathematics. The more I started thinking about these two constructs, prior knowledge or early knowledge and executive functions, the more I started thinking about like, what do these things even mean? Like, how are we defining them? How do these definitions differ across fields? How do educational psychologists talk about them versus how cognitive scientists talk about them? I was trained by a developmentalist, so I think most of my lens is influenced by the way that like core developmental or cognitive developmentalists think about it, and less how educational psychologists think about it. So I started to realize, like, even though my degree is in ed psych, I really view the world as a developmentalist or a cognitive developmentalist. And so it really started to push me in my thinking and think about, you know, what do I not have in common with the people who have the same degrees as me, and how it has an influence on the way I do my work. Right now, I'm currently teaching, so I have a 1-1 teaching load, so one course in the fall and then one in the spring, teaching child psychology. So I've taught that class probably like the 5th time at this point. So pretty comfortable teaching it. And it's particularly fitting because I have a 2-year-old.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'm guessing it's not like child psych might be at Seton Hall at a cozy 25 or so people in the room. Is it
It depends.
Okay.
So in the fall, it was 25 students. I taught the honor section. And then this semester is 50 students. But we do have sections that are over, well, like into the 80s, close to 100. I just haven't had the pleasure of teaching that many yet.
Great. Thanks so much for that context, and congrats on your first year as an assistant professor.
Thank you.
Big accomplishment, and a 2-year-old. So it's busy times for you, right?
Very much.
Right. Well, for the listeners, the reason that I asked Dana to come and chat today is because of your work on a panel at Northwestern, kind of talking about some of the things you previewed here, this idea of not just thinking about things in the way that our specific subdiscipline has looked at the world, but maybe taking a wider lens or an interdisciplinary lens. So let's just sort of start with kind of teaching a child psych class. You know, as a cognitive person, I've looked at child psych books that have kind of almost 10 cognitive chapters and then some other pieces. How do you approach that class? And how does your kind of training and experience influence that? And maybe if you want to talk about even any changes you've made from how you initially done and what you're thinking about now.
That's that. The tail end of that question is really helpful and important, because when I first taught this class, or the first couple of times I taught it, I was teaching the pre-service teachers. And so in the state of Pennsylvania, where I taught, there were these specific things that teachers had to know for their licensure. So there's a lot of focus on, okay, they have to know theories of intelligence or theories of learning. So Piaget, Vygotsky, they have to know these theorists. They have to be able to delineate between these theories. And so a lot of the focus was just like just kind of checking these boxes, like, okay, how do I make sure that they not just can identify them, but they can cite examples and even like have this information to guide their teaching. I think the way I was focusing then was, what would a teacher want to know about this? How would this be helpful? So, my approach was lots of examples, application. I had the luxury of doing a lot more of that because it was a 25 student class. And so at Temple, my orientation was like, what would a teacher need to know? Since then, I've had a son. I'm in a psych department now. A lot of these students want to become clinicians. So my approach is a little different in that I have a little more flexibility in what they need to learn because they don't have to get a license at the end of this, right? But a lot of my orientation now is like, if you ever spend any time with any child ever, here's what I would want you to know. And the funny thing is, a lot of the things I think they should know are not even in the textbook. So I think one thing for me as a parent is just when kids are first born, it's just like, whoa, you're really not sleeping. Like, I knew that you didn't sleep, but man, you really don't sleep. So really just trying to guide them. It's like, what is a day in the life of a parent of a newborn? What does that look like? What are things that seem odd that you never heard about? And then you have a kid and boom, this is actually really common. Like, for instance, with my son, he would often murmur in his sleep as a kid or move around a ton. I'm like, oh, he's awake. And those are things that don't really go into detail in a child psych textbook. So really just thinking about, like, if you ever babysit or if you ever have a kid, here are the things that you should know. We spent a lot of time talking about, even before children are born, types of services that mothers or birthing people get before they have a kid. So like genetic testing and like what that entails. How often you go to the doctor and how that might have looked during COVID, which was my experience. How things have changed since COVID. So I think before COVID, I think parents went to the doctor about 6 weeks in, and now they've pushed it back to 10 weeks. So they find, oh, well, you don't really need to come into the doctor until then, and what some of those visits might look like, how those visits look different depending on who you are and your identity, how different people are treated by the medical profession when folks are pregnant. So we get into a lot of discussions about disparities in maternal health outcomes, newborn or infant outcomes. I think the really interesting thing about this I didn't expect after taking this approach is that students come to me and say, there are so many things I did not know about these disparities in outcomes, and just thank you, because like a lot of them say they felt like they were in a bubble before this class. So that's a huge thing and a really nice thing to hear. But also, I can only imagine like sometimes what that feels like when you have you have one worldview of how things work, and then you leave and you're like, oh wait, this is not at all what I expected. Another time that comes up is when we talk about breastfeeding. And this assumption that it's just this easy thing that it's intuitive and it just happens. And I'm like, well, actually, here's what the data say. So I find myself supplementing a lot of the text for just what I can find from like the NIH website or different books or articles that have been published on the topic. So I guess, my orientation started off as, what does a teacher need to know? And now it's like, what would any caregiver want to know about this? And then even trying to give them more voice about like what their experiences were like. I think sometimes in a psych class, students will say, oh, well, this is what the research says, but that wasn't my experience. And I think that some professors, we may get annoyed because it's like, well, yeah, that's what your experience, but here's what the data say. Most people have experienced this. And so we have to give more value to what has been published. And I think that to some extent that's true. But at the same time, we're not accounting for individual differences. Which is one thing that my research kind of tries to take into account now. But also, I think it's important for students to have a voice in their classes. And their experience deviates from what we're talking about. That's an important piece to pay attention to, and to give them some say. And so they can, one, make the information more concrete, but also talk about, there's always an individual difference, and that's where your experience comes in, and that's a learning opportunity for them.
Thank you. And I think that is something I like that's globally applicable to anything that you're teaching. And anyone that's taught stats should know that, right? When you do a t-test, you're taking the mean of the data and you talk about standard deviation and you show pictures of curves that overlap or don't overlap. And it's like, right, there are some people that, in the treatment group, we're still scoring less than control participants. And yes, I think walking that line of getting them to value data and value research while recognizing individual differences. And it's also an opening of the door to, well, that may just be individual differences or maybe a function of who we're testing, because we've been talking a lot about how research hasn't been globally applied, right? I know there's an updated term for weird that I haven't memorized yet, but that whole issue as well. Oh yeah, you don't have it either, or you do have it?
I don't. Darn, I'm really kicking myself because I read the paper like 2 days ago.
Recall memory is harder than recognition memory most of the time, as we know, right? Those Dees Roediger McDermott's, and then I won't try to now implant a false version for you. If you're up for it, would you be willing to tell a little bit about your perspective as starting? Kent State is a PhD granting institution, so I'm guessing that in addition to teaching this, you're going to be training PhD students. Anything you want to wax on about for people that are hiring? As someone who's, knock on everything, our new hire has said they want to come, and so we'll be getting a new colleague. We don't have PhD students, but I'm still always want to be conscientious of how to be a good colleague. So, is there anything you want to share that's been super helpful
as being a new faculty member? Yeah, sure. So one thing I think that, and maybe this is a plug for Kent State. One thing I love about my institution is how generous people are with their time. I think when I first got there, I thought it was strange how often people knocked on my door and said, "Do you need anything? How are you settling in? Do you want, let me take you out for coffee. I'll buy you coffee." People were so hyper conscious of the fact that, one, when you're brand new anywhere, whether it's a grad student or anywhere, it's just, that first month is rough because you move in and it's like, whoa, all of my savings is gone from moving. And then you're just like trying to build yourself back up for that full year. So I've had faculty or colleagues rather come to me and say, "Let me buy you a coffee," or "Let me buy you lunch," or "Let me take you out." I have a colleague who I meet with once a week, and they're like, "You are not allowed to pay for anything for the first year because you're digging yourself out of a hole that we've all had to dig ourselves out of." So I think that the one thing is just being a good colleague. Like there's a human aspect to this, right? And so the human aspect here is just understanding that, I am building a lab. I am like trying to figure out how to teach my classes and balance teaching with research. But there's also a life piece too, right? Like just like all this money that was spent to get here. And I think that, I don't know that I've heard other people say they've had that experience. My 2-year-old is giggling playfully, sorry, with his grandfather in the background, if you can hear it. But I think there's a human piece that people don't talk about. And it's like, sometimes I've heard people say, well, we don't want to bother that new person. They're getting settled in. But there's some people I've spoken to have said they felt more isolated when no one checked in on them. Whereas that has not been my experience. And actually, sometimes I would argue that I almost felt overwhelmed with how giving or generous people have been, because it's almost like, gosh, I got to find time to meet with folks, right? So I would say like the one piece that's been really helpful is just how generous folks have been with their time. The other thing, this is a habit that I started when I was a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, which I guess I left out of my training. Yes, I was a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh for 2 years, and then also a postdoc at the University of Delaware for 2 years. So when I was at Pitt, I started a writing practice where I would try to get in at 8:00 because usually no one's in by that time, and write for at least 30 minutes. And I've maintained that practice since then. Since that was 2017, I started there. So I think the other thing that's been really helpful for me, people tell me, "Gosh, you're so productive. How do you do it? Do you not sleep?" I'm like, no, I get plenty of sleep. That's the part that I get. I sleep a lot, but also I wake up, I try to get into the office by 8:00. It helps to have a child that needs to be at school by a certain time because I'm up, and then I can start writing. So one thing that's really helped is trying to write for 30 minutes every day. If it goes beyond 30 minutes, great. And if it doesn't, like, okay, I did it. I did the things, and being set up the night before. So knowing what I'm going to sit down to do, because sometimes you work for 30 minutes and then it's like, where'd the time go? I haven't even done anything yet. And now I have to move on to the other thing. So getting that practice, it's in my calendar. I treat it like an appointment with myself, the same way I would treat going to my Zumba class or my cycling class, and I have to go, or a date with a friend. Like that has to get done, because otherwise just you spend your time doing the things that are most immediate, like teaching or a service or anything else that has a more immediate deadline. With my teaching, so that really helps that my chair is very, she tries to set it up in a way where it's like, these are classes you've taught before. Let me just give you a class you've taught before, so you can kind of jump right in. And so although I'm only teaching child psych right now, I will be teaching a class called Children's Thinking in the fall, which is a version of a class I taught as a graduate student. So really it's everything's pretty much a repeat. I can recycle so much. I've had friends or colleagues who or end up teaching brand new classes, and I can definitely see the difference in my experience versus theirs. So it's really helped out a lot. And then, the lab part, then the huge difference, I think, in my training and now being in a psych department, the psych undergraduates are so eager to get research experience. And so you have people knocking on your door to come work in your lab. So that is partially my experience, but also I acknowledge, just because I study math outcomes, some students are pretty, they are intimidated by that when they hear math. They're like, I don't want to do any math problems. Like, don't worry, you're not going to have to do them yourself. So I find that like students aren't as interested when I tell them what I study. But sometimes they'll come work with me because they just like me as a person, and they, enjoyed my class, and like, I really want to learn more from you, even though maybe they won't even consider going into grad programs. They actually just want to spend more time with me. And so we've created a really nice group. I have about 10 RAs right now, and they are amazing and so invested in everything that we do. So we're running 2 studies right now, one with the undergraduate pool and one in schools. And with the school data collection, psych pool, but that kind of like people just come. So it's like that study runs itself almost, right? And the classroom data collection, we only had one classroom for a while, and then they started calling their local teacher, like they're from the area, so they started calling up their local elementary schools and said, can we come do data collection? And they're like, sure, that's great. And so now we have like 9 classroom teachers and not enough RAs to do all the work. So gift and a curse, right? And so I think that having this group that's so invested has created a culture where everyone pitches in, and that's kind of helped, I think, be able to give prospective doc students, like, here's what we're working with, here are the projects we're working on, and our RAs can tell you what we're working on, to show that you're not just coming into a lab that has nothing really going on yet. And, I think some of that too is just being able to set the lab up has come so much, again, from the generosity of my colleagues and telling me, like, here, you should create a handbook, a lab handbook, and here's how to get in contact with schools, or here's how to get your undergraduate studies up and running. And then just having really invested students.
It sounds like things are great. As someone who really loves their job, getting to talk to someone else who also feels like is in a job that's going to be a really great fit makes me feel quite delighted for you. So
thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, but it's still work, right? I mean,
it's still work. It just feels more like play sometimes. So that's really nice. And I feel really blessed to be able to do something that's fun.
Great. Well, we are, right in our average episode length time, but I do always like to leave a few minutes for my guests to tell listeners anything that they didn't get to because I didn't ask a question that nudged it. It's pretty open. So the floor is yours. What would you like people that listen to a podcast about how to be a more effective teacher to be thinking about right now?
How to be a more effective teacher right now? That's a great question I don't have the answer to.
Well, it doesn't have to be about, I just mean these are the type of people that are listening, right?
Gotcha,
so these are not, if your answer was going to be, please put information in your syllabus, I'm pretty confident that everybody on this podcast.
Oh, I know what I want to say. So one thing so I'm a first generation college graduate, first in my immediate family to have a PhD and go into academia. And so, a lot of things, there's like this hidden curriculum, right? Of just, people don't know that you should be doing research if you want to go to grad school or get a PhD. People don't know how to go about getting research experience. And so in my class I have 50 students right now, I have made it now a habit these 2 semesters in a row to advertise like, hey, I'm looking for RAs. If you want to become a research assistant, here's what it entails. And then you have like students who reach out to you who are interested. And then there are students who don't reach out still, right? And I found that reaching out to students directly, especially students who might be also first gen, is really important. I have a couple of students who I've seen them work really hard, and as hard as it is to see in a class of 50, students who may not have the best grades, but the effort is unmatched. And just reaching out to them directly and saying, hey, I'm really impressed with your effort this semester. Would you be interested in getting research experience? I've reached out to 3 students at this point, and 2 of them have said, I was interested, but scared to reach out to you. And again, like I'm first gen, and, I've had very similar experiences to many of these students, and it didn't occur to me that I should reach out to them and ask them. So I would just nudge other faculty to do the same, whether they're first gen or not, because I don't think some of these things are very clear to students. I think that they have assumptions about who gets to be a research assistant and how to become a research assistant. I think that students it's not very clear to them what that process looks like or that trajectory looks like. And so reaching out to students who you think might be a good fit is really important.
That's great. Thank you. And an excellent reminder, and I'm going to think about that for my own lab. We handle it by doing a survey for both being a research assistant and a teaching assistant. And we had a similar conversation at a department meeting that sometimes good students need a nudge. And Seton Hall also has a nice, significant high number of first-gen students. So good reminder, right, that not everyone, I can see that, right? You're sitting in the class and you hear that. And if someone doesn't say it's me, it could be easy to think, right, we've had Lisa's son on here, imposter syndrome.
Totally.
Stuff comes into play, right? So you're like, all right, well, that person, that's probably who she's talking about, not me. So great. That's an excellent tip. Well, thank you so much for sharing of your time and your experience. It's been great talking to you. And I think our listeners will really enjoy hearing what you have to say and maybe be inspired to think about. A couple of tips, right? Be a generous colleague. Think about the practical implications of what you're teaching, and ask good students to work with you. Those are 3. Thank you in 22 minutes. Well done.
Thank you.
Good bargain for your listening minutes. I've been chatting today with Dr. Dana Miller-Cotto from Kent State University. Take care. Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSessions.